Chapter 5 of The Masked Empire by Patrick Weeks. In the slums of Halamshiral, whispers blew on the embers of rebellion. Cruelty from the nobles was nothing new. Every elf in the city knew to look down when a human walked by. The elven woman learned early on how dangerous it would be to travel alone or look too pretty. The elven merchants knew the fine dance of protesting enough that the nobles paid some of what they owed, but not protesting so much that their houses were burned to the torch. It was not loved, but it was known, and tolerated, and accepted as the way of the world. Lomet's death was unacceptable. Lomet had been a good man. His friend Thren and the other tradesmen whispered. He'd done honest work, kept his home clean, and even got business from the noble's coachman because of Lomet's low prices and kind, respectful manner. He had a slow temper and an easy laugh, and he bought drinks for his friends more often than not. Lomet wasn't gutter trash, they whispered, but Lord Mainserai's men had stabbed him, then hacked him apart, and hung pieces of the body throughout the city like the worst kind of criminal. If they could do this to a good elf like Lomet, who never made trouble, what might they do to everyone else? Lomet had died protecting a runner, the thieves whispered. Whatever he did to make his coin, he was a true elf at heart, and the Shems who cut him down like a dog had been trying to tell every elf in the slums that they owned the streets. It was past time the humans learned that there was always more rocks to throw. Lomet had come from a night at the tavern talking about the old days. Jeanette and the other true believers whispered. Whatever he'd said that night in the tavern, he'd heard of the time when Halamshiral was the home of the elves. Before the humans broke the peace and invaded, he'd listen. And when the noble whose ancestors had burned the elven homeland to the ground tried to kill an innocent child, Lomet had stood tall against him. Could any elf do less? Comte Pierre of Halamshiral, who had indulged Lord Mainserai's activities as long as no humans were hurt, ordered the patrols increased throughout the slums of the city. A group of elves returning home from a late night's work were harassed and beaten by the guards. The next morning, the guards were found dead in the market square, their ears hacked off in a manner used on elven bandits. Comte Pierre sent his chevaliers into the slums to make an example. They killed 10 elves who didn't have the sense to stay indoors, and awoke the next day to find that someone had killed their stablemen and slit their horses' throats. Lady Elspeth informed Lord Mainserai that his visits were no longer welcomed at her family's estate, as his uncouth behavior had stirred up the commoners that Lady Elspeth's servants had been unable to procure fresh berries to make her favorite tarts. As he rode back to the estate, fuming, a thrown rock sailed through the open window of his coach and bloodied his nose. The wiser nobles took an autumn holiday at their country estates. The foolish nobles increased their guards. And quietly, slowly, the word began to spread from Halamshiral across Orlais. For Selene, the weeks after Gaspard's failed gambits were sweet and quiet. She approached diplomatic documents, read reports, held audiences for investors and artists who wished for patronage, and put into motion plans for a ball thrown in honor of the divine. Or she might speak with the nobles and make some headway in the tension between the Templars and the mages. There had been no word from the divine's red-haired representative, though. No refusal, but no confirmation either, and the silence twisted knots in Selene's stomach. She lay awake again, and Briala curled up next to her on the side of the bed, watching the dawn. What Orlais needed, she thought, was another blight. Not that it would seriously help, and she would never wish such destruction upon her empire. But blights were, if not easy, at least simple. Gather everyone who can fight, throw them at the Darkspawn, and hope that the Grey Wardens could destroy the Archdemon. Politics were put aside eventually, if not immediately. The stories surrounding Loghain MacTyr's foolish betrayal of the Grey Wardens and the attempt to seize power during the last Blight have been confusing at best, but even the savage Ferelden nobles had eventually banded together. If Darkspawn swarmed from the Abyssal Rift, and another blight began, would Grand Duke Gaspard fall in line and bring his considerable military prowess to bear on an enemy that deserved it? Would the Templars and the mages turn their fury to the Darkspawn? Selene sighed. As simple as it sounded, she knew that another blight would rip Orlais apart far more brutally than any measure of infighting or civil strife. What was more, each blight saw cultures destroyed and knowledge lost. No one built libraries in times of war. Her university, her class of nobles learning to think critically instead of mindlessly following in the steps of their fathers, the commoners, and even the elves slowly making their way into the halls of learning. All of that would be put aside in the struggle to simply survive. "You need to sleep," Briala murmured beside her. "I'm sorry I woke you." "Don't be." Briala stretched, one arm trailing down Selene's side as she did. "You could have woken me up earlier." "Burdens of the Empress," Selene said, and smiled. Her lover's skin was dark against the creamy white satin of her nightskirt. Shirt. Briala rolled onto her stomach and lifted her face, meeting Selene's gaze. "Let me share them." "I don't want you to share them, Bria." Selene let her arm cradle Briala's body to soften the words. "You are my eyes and ears already. I want this." She pulled Briala close. "I want this for me alone. For us." Gently, Briala pulled out of Selene's grasp and sat up, still facing her. "Your Majesty, you know that isn't impossible. That isn't possible." She took Selene's hand, her fingers warm and strong. "Have you answered Remick?" Briala's eyes were so large and dark in the morning. It was like staring into an endless pool, soothing and deep. "You know he now backs Gaspard," Selene said with a sigh. They had both sworn long and loud the night after Gaspard made his proposal on the hunting trip, and Briala saved Michelle from the bard's trap. Gaspard had failed on both fronts, but knowing that Remick was lost gave the victory a bitter aftertaste. Briala squeezed her hand. "But can he not be turned back? If you answered him without acknowledging his change of allegiance, he might find ruling beside you more tempting than serving Gaspard. The fear of angering you by formally withdrawing his suit alone might compel him to—" I would lose you," Selene said, and the words caught her in her throat as she said them. "Bria, you're all I have, all that is really me." She pulled Bria in close, felt the warm arms come around her. The satin of Briala's shirt slid against Selene's skin like a cat arching its back to be petted. "Maker, I envy you sometimes." She knew immediately that she had said something wrong. She felt Briala stiffen, though her arms didn't move, and Briala's voice was light as she said, "The Empress of Orlais envies an elven handmaid." "You know what I mean, Bria." Still holding her, Selene patted Briala's back. "You could leave here, become someone else." "As long as that someone is an elf," Briala said with a dimpled smile. But Selene knew she was hurt. "Yes, I know. But I was born to sit on that throne. I can't do anything else. Since my parents and Lady Montillon," she trailed off. This time, Briala pulled away. "You will make a wonderful scholar," she said as she stood and pulled her robe on, "at least until Emperor Gaspard made a decision you found objectionable. Then, I believe trouble would ensue." She smiled over her shoulder. "You are probably right, my love." Selene rose as well and pulled her own robe on as if nothing were wrong. And I will consider, Remek. Briala nodded and slipped her mask into place, then left through the passage behind the mirror, and Selene sighed and fetched her little magic pot. She would be making her own tea this morning, it seemed. Briala was in the market catching up with her contacts when Philasen came again. I did not expect you to see you for months, she said as he picked his way past a group of merchants arguing over a wagon full of goods that caught her eye. This is a lovely surprise. Though her mentor's cloak was as clean as always, untouched by the grime his constant wandering should attract, Philasen's face looked drawn and tired beneath the shadows of his cloak. As much as I missed the sight of your lovely masked face, Dalen, I turned back for more practical reasons. What have you heard from Halamshiral? Briala followed him to the park where they had spoken just a few days ago. Nothing, she said. A pack of wealthy merchants' sons were nearby, laughing and tossing a wineskin back and forth as he trampled the grass. They sent leers her way, and she ignored them and kept her voice low. My birds are overdue. They often come late in the autumn. I've heard nothing from the ships arriving from across the waking sea. He smiled wearily. Well then, I did not tire my ancient bones for nothing. Some foolish Shemlin lord killed and brutalized an elven tradesman without cause. The angrier voices in the alienage are calling for Mianhara. The shock of it was so great that Briala laughed, despite herself. Over one tradesman? How many of our people are butchered every day? We will never know where the lightning will strike in the dry forest, Philasen said as he sat down in the grass. But I can smell the smoke. He gave the particulars, the name of the lord, and the dead elf, for what little that mattered. So the elves will rebel? They'll be crushed. This is... She broke off and started to pace angrily. Do they think this will help the Empress? This is the last thing she needs. The friends of the butchered tradesmen will be heartbroken, Philasen said. I imagine they are constantly considering Selene's needs. They had better. Briala spun on him. She's bending the divine to her cause. She's dealing with Gaspard. If this hurts her, do you think Gaspard will be better for the elves? If there is one thing I have learned, Philasen said, it is that major political changes are almost never based on what I think. He made an idle gesture. What you think, on the other hand, might change how the Empress of Relay reacts to this news. I can promise you that no one in Val Royeaux has heard this news before you. One of the merchant's sons overthrew the wineskin, and it sailed over the friend's head. Without missing a beat, Philasen took 2 steps, caught it, spun, and lofted it back without spilling a drop. The young men clearly looked offended that an elf had joined their game, but it had been a very good catch, and they had the good grace to laugh and nod. You're right, Haren. With an effort, Briala stilled herself. Thank you. Philasen smiled gently. Go. She made her way back to the palace, tugging her mask back into place and moving with unseemly haste through the wealthy district. Back inside, she made her way through the halls. The chatelaine saw her and called her away, but Briala ignored it. Whatever she had to pay later would be worth it. She found Selene in a conference with a university administrator and, stealing a tea tray from a serving girl, entered with a bow. She served the tea with the grace of years of training, never interrupting the administrator's charming request for more funding and better clarification on how many commoners would need to be admitted to the university to please the Empress. Selene gave Briala a single glance as she took her tea, sweetened with honey just as Selene had liked it since childhood. Back out in the hall moments later, Briala shoved the tea tray at the servant girl without looking and paced the halls, thinking. It had to be handled perfectly. Some would die in any event. Briala had learned a lesson on the day Lady Montillon murdered her parents and all the other servants to ensure Selene's safe rise to power. But the right words could save hundreds of lives. Briala could not afford to spare tears for inevitable deaths. In that respect, she supposed that she was more like the nobles she served than the elves in the marketplace. The thought sometimes sickened her, but, again, not as much as the thought of deaths she could have prevented. Selene summoned Briala to the stone room a few minutes later, and dismissed the other servants. She was standing by an open window, looking out over the gardens. The room had gotten its name from one wall, which was covered from floor to ceiling, with differently colored pieces of amber. They formed a mosaic of the Grey Wardens riding their legendary griffins against a horde of darkspawn. The Wardens and their griffins were done in brightest gold. The sky was pale, and the darkspawn, led by the great archdemon, were sooty red. The rest of the room held trophies and other art of the legendary order, though none was as detailed. One great framed map dated back to the Second Blight and showed how far the Darkspawn had spread at the height of their power. And in the corner of an empty suit of armor held safely behind glass was said to date back to the Divine Age, when Emperor Draken sent Orlesian armies against the Darkspawn to save the Grey Wardens besieged at Weishaupt. Selene gestured at a chair whose legs were carved griffin claws. Whatever you find in the market can usually wait until the evening. Briala sat. This cannot, Your Majesty. The elves in Halamshiral are angry. Lord Mainsarai killed a tradesman without justification, and the elves are calling for Mainharal. At Selene's silence, Briala added, It is an elven word. When the humans go too far, the elves remind them that even a short blade must be respected. They will rebel, Selene said, the words cutting through the chilly autumn air. Against me. Now. It is not a rebellion. It is not rebellion, Your Majesty. Briala bowed her head and took a shaky breath, clutching at the griffin head arm of her chair. This was exactly what she had feared. The elves of Halamshiral have never seen you. Their grievance is with neither you nor Olay. They only wish the justice for a man of your empire who died without cause. What they wish is irrelevant. Selene turned and stalked away from the window. I am already fighting a war on 2 fronts. I cannot be seen to fight a war on 3. Then don't. Briala rose, putting herself in Selene's path. Give them justice. A lord for the death of an elf? Damn this thing. With a quick jerk, Selene tore the mask from her face. Her face was flushed beneath, her eyes red from another night of little sleep. Shall I declare the elves equal citizens before the Maker, and the throne as well while I'm at it? Why not? Briala took her own mask off, stealing a quick moment to steady herself. Unless you don't believe that, and I'm just a jumped-up kitchen slut you haven't tired of yet. Selene turned away. Shall I declare the elves equal citizens before the Maker, and the throne as well while I'm at it? Why not? Briala took her own mask off, stealing a quick moment to steady herself. Unless you don't believe that, and I'm just a jumped-up kitchen slut you haven't tired of yet. Selene turned away, tossing her mask onto an overstuffed couch, and stalking to the great amber wall. You know I can't do that. Bria. I might as well engrave Gaspard's initials on the throne. Against a wall of gold and red, Briala's empress and lover looked pale and wan. Selene had always seen sleep as an enemy, or at most a necessary evil, from what Briala could tell, and since the events of Kirkwalk, The stress of rising tensions had her awake before dawn almost every morning. If it were early enough, Briala could sometimes coax her into lovemaking, and the warm and drowsy bliss afterwards would let Selene steal a few more hours of rest. Lately, even that had not been enough. Briala sighed. I do know. Instead of going to Selene, she went to a small table where Selene's teapot sat, forever just shy of boiling. She poured Selene a cup of tea, brought it over, and gently touched Selene's shoulder. It was not quite an apology. Selene turned, saw the tea, and sighed. I do what I can, Bria. I have pushed the nobles to help the elves. She took the saucer, lifted the cup to her lips, and inhaled slowly. Briala saw the set of her shoulders ease ever so slightly. I know. You have done more than anyone since Andraste herself granted us Halamshiral. Sadly, I do not believe it within my power to grant the elves Halamshiral at the moment, Selene said with a tiny smile. Briala matched her smile and took Selene's hand. I will table that suggestion then. Gently, respectfully, she led Selene to the overstuffed couch and pulled the Empress down beside her. The throne cannot bring this Lord Mainsarai to justice, and the elves will cause you nothing but trouble for it. So let me help. She took a breath. Send me to Halamshiral. Selene was silent for a moment. Her hand went still in Briala's grasp. You will kill Mainsarai? Briala nodded, confident and businesslike. I have the contacts to lead the elves. I can give them the blood they need, then gentle them before they think to turn to another target. It'll be an unexplained crime for the City Watch, not a rebellion, and if anyone asks your opinion, you can suggest that a lord who is so uncouth as to kill a harmless creature should learn to look to his own defense. Selene reached out gently and put a hand to Briala's cheek. She leaned forward, and when they kissed, Selene's arms went around Briala, fiercely tight. Then she stood, picking up her mask and sliding it back into place as she did, and walked slowly to the window, silent the whole time. Clean and quick, Bria, she said. Your radiance. Briala bowed and left to pack her things. Empress Selene slept alone that night. It wasn't as though Briala visited every night, of course. On some nights, Briala's duties kept her up late working, and when Selene visited another lord's estate, discretion kept them in separate beds. But it had been some time since Briala had been away. She woke up before dawn each morning, cold and alone, watching the darkness outside the window as though, if she stared hard enough, she could see all of them. The mages, the Templars, the elves, even Gaspard and Remek, and whomever else Gaspard had turned. They all lurked outside the palace, creeping closer each night as she slept, waiting for her to make the mistake that let them attack. Each morning, she made her tea, drank until the headaches faded to a distant buzz at the back of her head, and poured herself into old books of interest to nobody but scholars. She passed the next few days quietly, listening to the speeches and accepting gifts. News of the elven uprising Halamshiral reached the ears of Val Royeaux, and the assembled nobles and courtiers shook their heads and grumbled about the spoiled elves of Halamshiral, not knowing how good they had it compared to Ferelden and the rest of Orlais, where they lived in alienages. Comte Pierre sent apologies for the shameful behavior of his city, and made it clear that he would have the matter under control shortly, which left nobody satisfied. The nobles of Val Royeaux asked what Selene would do, and Selene gave polite non-answers and silently wished Briala a safe and swift journey. She attended a performance at the Grand Royal Theatre 3 days after Briala's departure, and that was when she discovered how far things had gone. The Grand Royal had been established almost 200 years ago. It had a reputation as the greatest theater in the empire, with the most famous performers, the most distinguished playwrights, and the most extravagant sets and effects, including, at some performances, smoke and flame conjured not through an alchemist's powders, but by a mage who had obtained permission to come from the circle and lend his expertise. As a result of having to constantly outdo its competitors, however, the Grand Royal had also come to the attention of both the Chantry and the throne for performances that bordered on the scandalous. Mad Emperor Ramil had restricted the theater to wordless pantomimes for fear that plays would somehow foment rebellion against his rule, and Selene's uncle, Emperor Florian, had nearly shut the Grand Royal down, although after one tasteless play, made light of the Orlesian occupation of Ferelden. Selene had made a point of supporting the theater financially and politically. She had pushed back against the Chantry's complaints, and on occasion when a play referenced her, either literally or metaphorically, she was always seen to laugh or applaud appropriately, a cultured empress with no concern for what might be said of her on the stage. In return, the playwrights of Orlais had always been kind. Her coach stopped before the main entrance by the lush carpet rolled out to signify that one of the grand nobles had deigned to attend the performance. Outside, the crowd stood at the respectful distance. "Orders, Majesty?" Michel asked. He had been quiet but vigilant since Briala had helped him escape Gaspard's trap, eager to redeem himself for his perceived failure. He had haltingly tried to apologize at one point, as Briala had suggested he might, and Selene had quickly silenced the conversation, making it clear that Sir Michel was blameless in the matter. Now was not the time to have a champion who did not believe in himself. "Observe, as always." Sir Michel nodded and stepped out of the coach, then turned and extended a hand to his sister. Outside, servants who had ridden atop the coach quickly swept dust from the lush carpet and pushed back commoners and lesser nobles as Selene stepped down. Something was off in the crowd. She felt it instantly. They bowed, of course, but the tenor of their murmurs was wrong, as Sir Michel escorted her inside, with servants carrying the long train of her dress and spraying rose water into the air before her so that the smell of the crowd would offer her no offense. She watched from the corner of her half-mask and listened as best she could. "Don't see her. Wouldn't be here." Inside, Selene accepted a bow from the current owner of the Grand Royal Theatre, a plump woman who had her merchant family's money to good use. Tonight, a woman wore a simple but fashionable gown embroidered with a laughing mask on one side and a weeping mask on the other, and thick tradesman's makeup just close enough to Selene's to honor the Empress without attempting to imitate her. Beneath the makeup, however, the lines on her face spoke of worry. Selene would have given anything to have Briala there. Her handmaid and lover was even better than Selene at pulling facts together from the smallest observations, and she could go places Selene could not, invisible in her servant's mask. As it was, she smiled politely as the theater owner led Selene to the royal booth, a richly decorated box that offered Selene and her guests a beautiful view of the stage, while offering the crowd a beautiful view of their Empress. One of the servants poured her tea, while another laid a purple velvet cushion down on Selene's seat. No matter how nicely decorated the royal booth was, it would not do for an empress to sit on what was amounted to a wooden bench. A third servant sprayed rose water into the air until the smells of sweat, salted food, and theater smoke were banished to satisfaction. "I believe I will take wine tonight," she said to the servant with the teapot. "Yes, Your Radiance." "While you fetch it, please send my compliments to Mademoiselle Architect upon the lovely new curtain. Also, Selene squinted thoughtfully at the lamp on the wall. Take another girl with you and find fresh candles. I do believe these are guttering. Yes, your radiance, said the servant, and left with another. The candles were doing no such thing, and Selene rarely took wine at performances, and her servants knew both these things. They also knew that Selene wouldn't want them to listen to the crowd, ask polite questions, and find out what's happening. None of them had Briala's skill, of course, but one did not personally serve the Empress of Relay without knowing how to play the game. The play, which had been billed as a romantic adaptation of the story of Andraste, started shortly thereafter. Andraste was played by a lovely young woman with blonde hair. She began her rebellion against Tevinter enthusiastically, though Selene found her performance to be more excited than intelligent. Selene had studied the historical texts, even the forbidden ones, and she suspected that Andraste had been much more political than the idealistic believer presented by the Chantry. Wars didn't get won otherwise. A quiet knock at her door made her turn. Michelle rose and opened the door, then turned to Selene. Duke Remek of Lydes, Majesty. Show him in, Michelle. Duke Remek stepped inside and bowed. Your Imperial Majesty, I saw that you were in attendance, and if it is not presumptuous, I hope that my unworthy company might be welcome. She bade him sit with a graceful flick of her wrist. If it is not to the detriment of your own companions, I would be pleased. He nodded and sat in the chair beside hers. Michelle quietly stood at the back of the private booth. For though Tevinter's mages rule, we see, 'tis better magic serve on bended knee, Andraste proclaimed down on the stage. An odd performance, Selene murmured. I expected a romance or a tragedy, but this? Remek glanced at her. And what do you think it is, Your Majesty? I would suspect a comedy. But even the Grand Royaux would not do that to the life of Andraste. Selene smiled. Although it might be the first recorded exalted march on a theater. Remek laughed quietly. Down on the stage, Andraste was convincing the rebels to ally with the elves. Against such magic, how can freedom reign? Our forces thus arrayed will not suffice, but with sweet justice as our own refrain, the elves shall come to aid us, once or twice. The crowd laughed nervously, and Selene saw the darkness below lighten, as hundreds of faces turned up to look at her. Shartan, the heretical elven warrior whose story of joining Andraste's fight against ancient Tevinter had been stricken from the chance of flight, had walked on to the stage. He had been cast as a woman, and she was wearing a dress, her hips swaying with comic exaggeration, and her wooden prop ears huge, so that even those at the back of the room could tell that she was an elf. She kissed Andraste's hand, and the crowd whistled. Selene felt the world go still around her. The back of her neck tightened, and she held herself motionless. After a moment, she said, I had thought to bring up a matter you had proposed earlier, Duke Remek. I am not certain I recall any matter that requires further discussion, Your Radiance. He did not take his eyes off the stage as he said it, and he was smiling as he watched. I see. I would hate to ruin your enjoyment of the performance, Selene said. Tell me, do you see many? Only those I have paid for myself. It would appear that Gaspard paid for this one, Selene said, keeping her face from betraying any emotion that the crowd might see from below. With a feather. Oh, I am no chevalier to care about fencing with feathers, Remek said, still not looking over. But Gaspard cares greatly for the hunting in Lydes. Well, for you, it seems merely an obligation. Down on the stage, Mafrath waved his arms in outrage. The lone force of reason, as Andraste and Shartan flirted and teased, and completely ignored the war with Tevinter. When rulers to their hearts become a slave, ignoring duty to cavort with elves, does any heart so noble and so brave not see the need to take the fight themselves? Am I to understand, Selene said without looking over, that Mafrath will be the hero, making the necessary sacrifice by betraying Andraste? Well, in this version of the play, Andraste seems to have taken an elven lover and forgotten her duty, your majesty. Remek paused. Still, I wouldn't want to spoil the ending. I know one ending. The playwright will be executed, Selene said. Possibly the theater owner as well. To be fair, Duke Remek said, this last-minute change to the script was something of a surprise to the theater owner, as was the disappearance of her son, though I assume the lad will be found safely later tonight. And what evidence will I find leading back to you, Remek? None, your radiance. Though I will make lavish donations to the Chantry in apology for a play I sponsored being undermined by some sick heretic. Selene stood. Tell Grand Duke Mafrath that I seem to have lost a wager on whether he was literate. Sir Michel opened the door, staring daggers at Remek, and Selene left, ignoring the murmurs from the crowd below. She kept herself steady until Michel closed the door behind her. Then, when she was alone but for Michel and her servants in the darkened hallway, she lowered her head and took a breath. They knew. Damn them all, they knew. It was still possible that it was merely meant as a metaphor, an attack upon Selene for letting elves into the markets and the university. But she did not think so. Duke Remek had said an elven lover, very specifically, and such a thing, even though the metaphor of a stage, was not said in the game unless one was certain. Briala, the one part of her life she had kept as her own these many years, was being used to attack her. Gaspard and his thugs would take away the one comfort, the one woman she loved, so that he could get the damned war he wanted. You have used your throne to defend the arts and scholarly sciences for so long. A soft voice came from the shadows. It seems so cruel for Gaspard to use it against you now. Selene looked over at the Divine's red-haired representative, conspicuous with her Ferelden features and her unmasked face. The theaters have always been fickle, Liliana, and I do not believe that the university has turned. She looked at Michel. Get the other servants and find out what they have heard. We are leaving. Majesty. Michel nodded and stalked off with the rest of her servants in tow, and Selene went into the shadows where Liliana stood. She held up a tightly bound scroll. Several of the professors have been asked to write papers about the elves. One will be saying that their large ears mark them as similar to rabbits, which means that they are simple prey animals, relying upon base instincts for survival and not to be trusted. Another will claim that anyone fornicating with the elf is insulting to the Maker, as one who lies with animals. 20 years of fighting to bring an empire of savages the grace and culture it needed to remain the greatest country in the world, and now the very people she had sought to help mocked her, threatened her with death, and played up her battle with Gaspard for the amusement of the commoners. 20 years of relative peace, enlightenment, and safety for Olay would be cast aside because playwrights and scholars could snidely reduce it to the foolishness of a love-struck girl cavorting with an elf. Selene shut her eyes. And what does the Divine think about this? Liliana smiled. The Divine had never had a very high opinion of the theater, your radiance. At Selene's silence, the Divine's representative sighed. The elves are the children of the Maker, just as we are, and are just as deserving of his grace. But the Divine will not say that, Selene guessed. Liliana looked away. She had been trained as a bard, so every movement she made was likely deliberate, but Selene thought that her discomfort was genuine. I have been comrade in arms with elves. I would not see them harmed. But you did not ask for her support in the matter. She looked back at Selene. You asked for her support calming the Templars and the mages. Indeed, Selene nodded. And will she give that support?
Liliana let out a breath. She will, she said, nodding slowly. But in return, she needs to know that the matter with the elves is under control. Selene felt her heart break inside her, for all that she had known within moments of how the conversation would go. She breathed a heavy sigh, and then said, "Of course. I could hardly ask the Divine to keep her affairs in order, were I not willing to do the same myself. I hope you enjoy the coming ball in Justinia's honor. I fear I will not be able to attend it in person." "The Divine understands," Liliana said, and in a soft, sad voice, added, "Walk with the Maker's blessing." "Majesty!" Selene looked up sharply and took a steadying breath as she pulled herself upright. It was Sir Michel, with Selene's entourage close behind him. The two servants she had sent out to investigate earlier looked disheveled. One of them had her makeup smeared across her jaw and mouth, as though she had been slapped. The other had streaks just below her half-mask, as though she had been crying. "What have you found?" she asked, glancing into the shadows. Liliana had disappeared. "As you saw in the play," he said, grimacing, "the crowd is saying that you are too lenient with the elves." Selene waved in irritation, and he went on. "They claim that you tax them less, that you wish to let them run free from our laws. They say that you pity them, and some were speculating that you might have made secret deals with the Dalish to strip nobles of their land and return the Dales to the elves. There is even talk about your Briala." Michel looked at the wall. "They say she is, that the two of you are..." "The word is lover, Michel." "Yes, Majesty, that is what they are saying." Michel's fists were clenched at his sides. "If you like, I would be happy to return to the lobby to make it clear that such talk is unacceptable." Selene smiled and straightened. The servants needed to see her strength now. "No, that would silence one voice and give rise to 100 whispers in its place. If the people fear that I am soft-hearted for the elves, it will take action to disabuse them of that notion." There were countless options, but she had discarded all but a few immediately. New trade restrictions, or revoking her request to the university to admit the elven scholar. Those actions would convince a few, but they would not sweep the empire, leaving no doubt of Selene's strength. For that, only one thing would suffice. She had known it while talking with Liliana, and in her mind she begged forgiveness for the pain she knew Briala would feel. But there was no other way. "Gather our forces. We march on Halamshiral." "Empress?" "I have a rebellion to crush." And that is Chapter 5 of Masked Empire.